Hey all you remote learners out there, how are you today? So today we're going to continue to talk about Chapter 14, Section 1. We're pretty much done with that, but we'll kind of review some of the main ideas. And then we're going to be moving into Chapter 14, Section 3, as we continue to talk about how did World War II impact Americans at home. So we're going to start off by talking about the daily life of average Americans and how the war was impacting, just regular daily products or processes like being a consumer. And then we're going to go into talking about different groups and how they were impacted by World War II. So the first thing to talk about, if you watch the Crash Course video, they've got some great video clips and footage and images which really kind of talk about some of these ideas. But remember, now that World War II has begun and the United States is involved in it, we would have to say that the Great Depression is finally officially over. Between 1941 and 1943, unemployment goes from 14% down to 2%. Part of the reason why it goes down, obviously, is that you've got millions of men who are enlisting in the military and the rest that are getting drafted, so naturally you have less people who are looking for a job. And then the rest of the population has a job because they are producing goods. Because remember what we talked about in our last lecture, was that goods and products was going to win the war. FDR wholeheartedly believed that it was going to be important for us to create goods that we could give to the Allied powers, but also that we could send to, not only our own troops, but to the British, to the Russians, and perhaps even to the French if they were eventually, kind of freed. So unemployment is down to this incredibly low number. Fantastic. And there's jobs everywhere. Mostly those jobs are going to be out in California, in Chicago, on the East Coast, in major cities. In the South, there's not a whole lot of jobs available because it's agricultural based. There's only 2 big cities. They don't have a lot of factories. And so we do see this second great wave of migration where many African Americans who have not been drafted yet by the military are going to choose to move north and get jobs in factories to help kind of do their part. And because, of course, wages are raising. In the Great Depression, companies could barely afford to, pay their employees. And so wages were at a startling low wage, and people were only working 6, 8-hour shifts. Children, of course, were not working, which was a fantastic thing that resulted because of the Depression. But now that World War II is occurring, companies are expecting that people are going to work 10, 12 hours a day, long shifts, but luckily they are going to be compensated for their work. These companies are trying to give their employees incentives for working long, hard hours, perhaps with bonuses. And a lot of these companies are, producing, whether it's planes or tanks or cars or food or, clothing for the soldiers. They have these government contracts and they're operating under this cost-plus mentality of, we're going to get the job done, we're going to get it done in time, and if not early, so we can, earn that bonus. And then that will create, huge profits for the company, for the shareholders, but also for the employees themselves. So naturally, people are working long hours, and the pay is decent, but it is difficult if they would like time off. If they want time off, they're probably going to get denied by their employer. Many people choose to join unions. Union membership goes up incredibly during this time period. And eventually, the government creates a war labor board to help kind of settle disputes between large corporations, not really small businesses, more like your Ford, your GE, your General Electric, John Deere, something like that, and the employees. And they get them to agree to a no-strike pledge, that they're not going to go on strike because if they're not producing goods, then how can we possibly win this war? The idea here was we wanted to have every single tank available and plane filled with a soldier so that they could, help take down the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians, and perhaps defend the United States in case there was an attack at home. And so the War Labor Board was able to make a lot of compromises. Now, as people got paid this huge income, they were encouraged, of course, through propaganda, to go out and to buy war bonds, whatever you call them, victory bonds, liberty bonds, and give back to the war effort. And some people did do this because, honestly, there wasn't a whole lot of stuff to spend their money on. Right now, rationing was going on. They would go to a store and there were shortages. Families were encouraged, yet again, like in World War I, to grow their own food in a victory garden because, the best meat and vegetables and everything was getting canned and sent over and ready-to-eat meals for the soldiers. And the stores simply don't have the consumer goods that you would like. If you would like, a new dress or a new suit or a new shirt, there might be only a limited selection since companies were only producing so many different types of clothing in so many different colors. A lot of the, their time and effort was being spent making goods for the soldiers. So, yeah, there definitely was shortages, and people are going to then, of course, have this burst of consumerism after World War II. And as they come home from the war and they have children, the baby boomers, maybe your grandparents, they're going to be, or wouldn't be your parents, I guess it'd be, yeah, probably your grandparents. They'd be out and about trying to buy all these new goods which are available because hopefully they've been saving up their money. Now, because there were shortages, at first people tried to get others to pay exorbitant, very high prices for basic goods, and the government put a stop to this. The Office of Price Administration fixed the prices of goods, saying this is the maximum amount of price of money that you can charge for milk or bread or eggs or beef, so that people, or butter, so that people are, taking out these government-issued ration books, and then they would only be able to buy that product even that week, even if they had the money, only if they had the correct stamp or certificate. And so sometimes people had to trade with each other if they wanted to make a cake and they didn't have, any butter stamp. So they would have to trade, with somebody else a beef stamp. And of course, their oil, their gas were being rationed as well. The idea was that, the U.S., even though it supplied a lot of oil for themselves and other countries, all of these new creations, these tanks and planes, were going to be requiring oil and gas, and so they really want Americans to limit their driving. And so they were going to be rationed with how much they were being allowed to drive from place to place as well. So overall, life was definitely different in this time period than it had been before. But most businesses are making money, farms are making money because, of course, farmers are producing lots of food for themselves, for the troops, but also for the Allied powers. And in general, the economy really has a boost. There's nothing that's great for an economy, honestly, like a war. And since they were paying for this war through tax dollars and not just through loans, they were going to have sizable debt. Let's be clear about that. But it still wasn't going to be as bad as one might imagine. And so Americans were exhausted working these 90-hour, not more than 90 hours a week. But yet again, it's a sacrifice to be made considering soldiers are doing the same on the home front. Just so you can kind of see, these are some of the ration stamps that you would have. And so these different ration stamps would be, to buy coffee, to buy, you can see the grain there, to buy sugar, to buy butter, just for different things that you would possibly be wanting to buy. Gasoline, you name it. Here's your gas fuel ration ones. And then you get 2 red points and up to 4 cents a pound if you use kitchen fat. So they're encouraging you to, keep your kitchen fat, recycle it, which sounds strange, but they have uses for it, to keep, metal parts kind of oiled and working as opposed to using oil. So using just natural fats from when you cook beef on the stove or anything like that. And then, of course, they had all sorts of recycling drives for rubber tires and for steel, aluminum foil, you name it. They wanted people to recycle anything and everything because they didn't have the time to produce goods like we once did. We were simply going to have to recycle and make do with what we had. And here's just some propaganda posters for Victory Gardens. We'll have lots to eat this winter. Mother, won't we, Mother? Grow your own, can your own. And there were lots of posters like this to encourage people to, if you want to can your own food, you're definitely going to have enough food to eat in the winter. And especially since when they went to the stores, a lot of the stuff was limited. So you like to eat a certain vegetable, grow it, can it, make your tomato sauce or salsa, whatever. A lot of people still can goods today. So that way you're guaranteed, fresh food in the upcoming year. And we talked about the production, the shortages on consumer goods already. But you can just see kind of the women ogling the new fashions there in the shop window. But even though they get to see those fashions, they're probably in limited supply with very few hats actually available to buy. And remember, this is a time period when everybody wears a hat, man or woman, yet hat, they were in short production and short supply at this time. Most of the hats that are being produced are, if you notice, a couple of those women are in the military. They're either wax or waves, working for the Army and Navy respectively, and so they're wearing the hats that go along with their uniform, not fashionable hats as they would like. So let's talk a little bit more about women. During World War II, we see, of course, there's going to be a push for women to take on men's work, no differently than there was in World War I. And of course, this is going to lead to a change in how people see women overall. After World War I, women finally got the right to vote. People realized that there was nothing unfeminine about women working, that women could work, that they could take care of their family, that they could hold multiple roles in society, and they should still be allowed to participate in politics. The same is going to be true in World War II. Women are going to play vital roles. 6 million women enter the workforce, and some did do clerical work, but many do what's considered men's work. So more of men's work being like a mechanic, or working in the steel industry, or in the coal mines, things of that nature. We know that 200,000 women joined special non-combat military units. So that's specifically the WACs and the WAVES, which I'll show you a picture at in a minute. And the side effects here is that women being basically single mothers while their children are at school and their husbands are off at war, we're going to see the increased creation of daycare centers and perhaps child delinquency. And we're going to see that, I'm going to pause for a second. Sorry guys, we're in a different spot today. So yet again, we just got moved. So a different spot, so I have to record from a different place. So yeah. Basically, if mothers are off at work all day, we're going to see more daycares, we're going to see child delinquency, kids trying to skip, elementary school, high school, kids trying to lie about their age to enlist in the military early to do their bit. It's definitely different. And, you've got a third of the women who are eventually in the workforce, a lot of married women, as well as young single women. And after, up to a third of the workforce is going to be female dominated. And then unfortunately, after World War II, it's going to be expected that women give up their jobs. And so, yeah, it's going to be expected that women give up their jobs after World War II. And that, instead, men come home and take their jobs. Some women are going to be happy to do so and create families. And you've got the baby boomer generation, but some will resent this fact. And we'll see by the late 50s, the beginning of the women's lib movement into the 60s, where, women are focusing on a sexual revolution and liberation and more rights and equality for women. And of course, you can't talk about World War II without talking about the icon of Rosie the Riveter. And Rosie the Riveter, I've got a video clip for you to watch about it, but the most famous poster, of course, of Rosie the Riveter is the one on the right that everyone really kind of thinks of as Rosie, compared to the actual real Norman Rockwell kind of painting of a woman who was a riveter. So you can watch the video clip to learn a little bit more about that. During World War II, 18.8 million women worked, which began to change people's attitudes about working women. And just some more pictures of women doing men's jobs. And as I said, some women do serve in the military, but in a non-combat position. The military is still pretty biased, and they're moving towards more modern ideals, but they're not going to let women in combat yet. And so if women wanted to join, they could be part of the Women's Army Corps, which is basically part of the military. They're considered officers in the Army, and they're going to do a whole bunch of different jobs like mapping, logistics, trying to figure out how to move troops, supplies, regular jobs, but more office-based jobs in the military. They're not going to be seeing any combat of any kind. And of course, women are still encouraged to become nurses, to donate blood. And for the Navy, women are encouraged to join the WAVES. And you've got share the deeds of victory. Have you got what it takes to do an important job like this? Enlist in the WAVES. And yet again, mostly, it's all non-combat, so it's, just more office-type work as far as figuring out, if people receive their immunizations, their shots, keeping track of who's been killed, things of that nature. Women did serve as nurses in the military. I mentioned that before. And then you've got the cadet nurse, the girl of the future. And women also did serve as photographers. They asked women to basically make propaganda-type photos and films about what it was like to be a soldier, so that they basically could try to show families at home what it was like. And of course, these were censored videos, to try to show the best parts of the Army, to try to not scare families. They didn't want to actually show, the truth of war and how difficult and scary it was. They didn't want to scare the families at home, since people were terrified enough that an attack could happen on U.S. soil at any time. So now we're going to move to talking about specific groups in World War II. And we've already kind of said that World War II is different than World War I because, in this war, you're going to see that African Americans are allowed to serve in segregated units, but they are allowed to serve in combat. Native Americans are serving. Quite a few Native Americans do choose to serve. So they decide to, serve, which is very different because, of course, in World War I, they could not, and they weren't citizens yet. And specifically, we'll talk more about next week how the Navajo Indians are going to play a vital role in World War II as basically code breakers in a sense, and using their Navajo language as a code in itself to transmit messages, so that the Germans and the Japanese cannot break their codes and their messages about where they're going to be attacking next and moving troops. Mexican Americans, about 500,000 of them do serve in World War II, and Japanese Americans are going to be barred from serving in World War II. So we're going to talk about Mexican Americans and we're going to talk about Japanese Americans. Let's talk about these next two groups here. So I kind of already went over the basics here, that Native Americans, a third of all healthy Native American men aged between 18 and 50 served during World War II, not being allowed to serve in World War I because they were not considered citizens until the 1920s. And 1930 is when finally the Dawes Act ended, so they were no longer forced to be on reservations. And they finally, under the Indian Reorganization Act in 1933, gained citizenship by the efforts of John Collier. And I talked about the Navajo Indians. We talked about African Americans, of course, playing a vital role in the war as far as the Tuskegee Airmen, shooting down so many German planes and Japanese planes and risking their lives daily, winning several medals of honor. And then when it comes to Mexican Americans, Hispanic Americans, we know that about 500,000 serve in the military total. And during this time period, there's quite a bit of changes going on in America in terms of immigration with Mexico. So people who were Mexican American citizens or Hispanic American citizens, considering that they came from somewhere in Central South America, when it came to these groups, if they're citizens, they're of course allowed to serve in the military. But during this time period, the U.S. government actually opened up a new program called the Bracero program that John Green mentioned in the crash course video yesterday, where the U.S. government basically paid for 200,000 Mexican migrants to come to the U.S. to farm the southwest portion since so many soldiers were deployed. And so California, of course, grows so many products for the U.S. There was no one basically to work that land. The women who normally would be working that land, a lot of them were encouraged to go work in factories to do their part, or they couldn't manage the farms without, their husbands, their children to help them. And so this program existed till 1964. So yet again, when we talk about our relationship as the United States with Mexico, until the 1960s, the U.S. openly encouraged Mexicans to cross the border and to come to the United States to live here or to continuously crossing back and forth. So we had a very open border situation where Mexicans came, they worked, they made money, they took it home, they went home for a while, and they came back and forth, and we had an open border. So it's a very different change, during the past 50, 60 years is something to kind of look at. The other thing is to talk, of course, about Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans were not allowed to serve in the military. People looked at Japanese Americans as if they were all spies, as if they were responsible in some way for Pearl Harbor, which was completely unfair considering some of them were born in America, had never been to Japan, had never, didn't speak Japanese, didn't have any relatives who were alive in Japan, and they'd lived here, since the 1800s, perhaps. I mean, they'd come, during the 1850s gold rush. Now it's the 1940s, 90 years later. Yet, the U.S. government is going to be very biased against Japanese Americans. Eventually, the U.S. government decides that Japanese Americans who are second generation, meaning their parents were born here and now they're born here, they were eventually allowed to serve in the military because they had such long-standing ties to the U.S. But it took the U.S. quite a long time to do that. They just had this feeling that Japanese Americans would support Japan in the conflict, which is completely crazy because it's not like they said, oh, you're an Italian American, you can't serve. Oh, you're a German American, you can't serve. So I understand the fear that somehow they would support their home country or they'd have relatives at home, but obviously they made the choice to move here, for a reason. And this is just complete discrimination on all accounts. So let's talk a little bit about the Zoot Suit riots. So as we move from 1942 into 1943, you have this large group of Mexican Americans as part of this Bracero program who are coming to America, staying for several months in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Texas, California, farming, working the land, going home, spending their cash, and then coming back to the U.S. And this was a government-sanctioned approved program. But it led to a lot of drama and tension in the southwestern portion of the U.S., specifically in California. We know that there was a lot of tension where some people considered these Mexican Americans who were teenagers or in their early 20s as juvenile delinquents, as troublemakers, who just caused a lot of problems. And there was perhaps some truth to this statement, but yet again, this became a stereotype, and so it just led to just early discrimination against Mexicans, where people were like, oh, you're Mexican, clearly you're a troublemaker. And so looking at the different uniforms, a lot of the Mexican Americans or just Mexican migrants who were living in the U.S., they often wore zoot suits, and you can see kind of what it looks like in the picture there on the right. They were big jazz fans, and they wore these longer suit coats, and they liked to dance, and they had like this wide-brimmed hat with these baggy pants. And they called each other Mad Cats, and they were really into jazz. They looked pretty different than typical Americans at this point who were not serving in the war effort. And obviously there are some men who are not serving because they're waiting to get drafted, or they have a medical problem. If you have flat feet, if you have a heart problem, a hearing problem, a vision problem, that could keep you from serving in the war. And so Americans who were too young, too old to fight, or who had physical, mental issues who were not fighting, it was still very typical for men to wear hats as they went around their daily life. That was still considered normal dress. People didn't dress in sweatpants like they do today. And to go to the store, they would wear a suit. It was just kind of more their day suit that was more casual or made out of wool. And to save money on fabric, the suits at this point, the victory suits, they had no vest, which was very typical prior to this time, to save basically money and fabric for the war effort. So they looked very different. So you could really distinguish who was a zoot suiter compared to who was an American based off their clothing in addition to their looks. And we know that in Los Angeles, a fight breaks out. It's between sailors who are home on leave. Their ship has docked at the port, and they're home on leave for a week. And one of the sailors' girlfriend, who had been having some relations, an affair of sorts, with one of the zoot suiters. And so the sailor, as well as his buddies, got into a fight with the zoot suiter and his buddies over this girl. And before you know it, the fight escalated. And the sailors did terrible things. They, were very angry, and they were looking for someone to take it out on, and they were used to obviously fighting. They were in this aggressive wartime mentality, but that's no excuse for attacking, killing people. And so they went to the zoot suiters' neighborhoods where they were living, to their apartment complexes, and they started to destroy their property, to rob them, to burn stuff, just to beat them up. And so then naturally, the zoot suiters took it out on the sailors. This goes on for several days. The police don't really intervene. Eventually, the Los Angeles Police Department does arrest the zoot suiter, who they believe started it all. And he gets beat up in jail. He gets charged with disturbing the peace, and the sailors, they're simply basically escorted back to their base and told to stay there. Some of them sneak out. Some of them come back and fight and destroy more property. But basically, the U.S. military intervenes and says this is a military issue. This doesn't have anything to do with the police. We'll deal with it on our own since they're on active duty. They'll get punishment here. It's unclear if they really got any punishment. We don't think so. Like, in a normal situation, these people would be thrown in jail for destructing private property, disturbing the peace. But all of these people we think really got was a slap on the wrist, perhaps some extra cleaning duties, kitchen duties and sorts. And I think we're going to wrap it up there for now. I think we'll tackle Japanese Americans in next time. All right, guys, that's it for now. Later.